I came home from work on a Tuesday evening in late September to find a massive bonfire pit being constructed in the middle of my wooded lot in Raleigh, North Carolina. Not near my house, not on the cleared section where I actually lived, but deep in the trees where I specifically left everything natural, because I loved the wildlife and the peaceful sound of leaves rustling in the wind. 3 men in safety vests were hauling river rocks and digging a huge circular pit, while a fourth directed them with animated hand gestures. A truck with Wilson Landscaping painted on the side sat parked on what used to be untouched forest floor, tire tracks cutting through the undergrowth like scars. My first instinct was that I had somehow hired these people and forgotten about it, which would have been completely unlike me, but stranger things had happened. Then I saw her. Patricia Hoffmann, the president of our homeowners association, standing there with a clipboard and her signature pearl necklace, looking like she owned the place. Technically, I owned the place, all 3 acres of it, but that never seemed to matter to Patricia. I parked my truck and walked over, my work boots crunching on fallen leaves. "Patricia, what's going on here?" She turned to me with that smile she always wore when she was about to tell you something you absolutely did not want to hear. "Oh, Samuel, perfect timing. We're installing the community bonfire pit. It's going to be absolutely wonderful for neighborhood gatherings." "On my property," I said, keeping my voice level. "Well, yes, but according to the HOA bylaws, all property within Meadowbrook Estates can be utilized for community enhancement projects. We voted on it at last month's meeting. The meeting I wasn't at because I was in Atlanta for my sister's wedding." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "You received the notice. Attendance is optional, but the decisions still apply to everyone. That's how associations work, Samuel." I looked at the men working, then back at Patricia. "You can't just build something on my land without my permission. That's not how property ownership works." "Actually," she said, pulling out a sheet of paper from her clipboard, "if you read Section 47B of the revised bylaws from 2018, which you signed when you purchased your home, the HOA has the right to implement community improvements on any lot within the subdivision for the collective benefit of all residents." I took the paper from her and scanned it. The language was deliberately vague and confusing, talking about common areas and community spaces without clearly defining what those meant. "My wooded lot isn't a common area, Patricia. I pay property taxes on it. I maintain it. It's mine. The interpretation of what constitutes community space is at the discretion of the HOA board," she said. "We've consulted with our attorney, and he assured us this is perfectly legal." One of the workers called out to Patricia, asking about the dimensions of the pit. She excused herself and walked over to them, leaving me standing there with growing anger burning in my chest. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The truck, the workers, the destruction of my forest floor, the massive pile of rocks, and Patricia directing it all like she was conducting an orchestra. When she came back, I tried again. "Patricia, I'm asking you nicely. Please stop this construction and leave my property. And I'm telling you nicely that we're well within our rights. The bonfire pit will be lovely. We're planning to have our first gathering in 2 weeks, weather permitting. You're welcome to attend, of course. I don't want a bonfire pit on my land. I want my woods left alone." She sighed like I was a difficult child. "Samuel, you need to think about the community. Not everything is about what you want. We have 47 homes in this subdivision, and the majority voted for this improvement. Democracy in action." "Democracy doesn't override property rights," I said. "Take it up with our attorney if you're so concerned. His contact information is on the HOA website." She turned back to the workers. Make sure the fire ring is at least 6 feet in diameter, gentlemen. We want plenty of space for a proper fire." I stood there for another moment, watching them destroy my peaceful woods, then walked back to my house. My hands were shaking with frustration. I had bought this property 3 years ago specifically because of the wooded lot. The house itself was nice enough, a modest 3-bedroom ranch, but the real selling point was the forest behind it. I loved walking through those trees, watching the deer, listening to the birds. I had even put up several bird feeders and a small bench where I would sit with my morning coffee. Now they were turning it into some kind of community gathering spot without even asking me. Inside my house, I made myself a sandwich I didn't really want and started researching. The HOA bylaws were a nightmare of legal jargon, but as far as I could tell, nothing explicitly gave them the right to build structures on individually owned lots. The section Patricia had referenced talked about maintaining common areas and making improvements to shared spaces, which I interpreted as the entrance to the subdivision, the small retention pond, maybe the street signs, not someone's private property. I called my friend Derek, who worked in real estate law, but it went to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking for advice. Then I started thinking about other options. If the HOA thought they could do whatever they wanted, I needed to find a way to stop them that didn't involve a lengthy legal battle I might not be able to afford. That's when I thought about the fire marshal. A bonfire pit in the middle of a wooded area seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would need permits and safety inspections. I had done some volunteer work with the local fire department a few years back, helping with their annual fundraiser, and I remembered the fire marshal, Chief Mike Brennan, talking about all the regulations around open flames and outdoor fires. I pulled up the Raleigh Fire Marshal's office contact information and made a note to call them first thing in the morning. For now, all I could do was watch from my back porch as the workers continued destroying my forest floor, hauling in more rocks, digging deeper, creating this monument to HOA overreach. The next morning, I was on the phone with the fire marshal's office at 8 o'clock sharp. A woman named Jennifer answered, and I explained the situation. She put me through to Chief Brennan, who remembered me from the fundraiser. "Samuel Foster, right? You manned the grill at our barbecue in 2022, he said. "That's me. Chief, I've got a situation. My HOA is building a bonfire pit on my property without my permission, and I'm pretty sure they haven't gotten any permits or clearances." A bonfire pit. How big are we talking? At least 6 feet in diameter, from what I heard them say. It's in the middle of a wooded area, surrounded by trees on all sides. They finished the construction yesterday evening. There was a pause. "That's a significant fire hazard. Do you have the address?" I gave him my address and explained exactly where the pit was located on my property. He said he would send someone out that afternoon to inspect it. I thanked him and hung up, feeling like I had finally done something productive. I called in sick to work, which I almost never did, but I wanted to be there when the fire marshal showed up. I spent the morning doing research on fire safety regulations in Wake County. Turns out, there were a lot of rules about open burning, especially in wooded areas. You needed to maintain certain clearances from structures and vegetation. You needed permits for anything over a certain size. And during dry seasons, open burning could be banned entirely. The more I read, the more confident I felt that Patricia and her HOA board had massively overstepped. Around 2 in the afternoon, a white SUV with Fire Marshal printed on the side pulled up to my house. Chief Brennan himself had come, along with a younger inspector named Torres. I met them at the door and led them through my backyard into the woods. The bonfire pit looked even worse in the daylight. They had cleared a wide circle of forest floor, removing all the natural leaf litter and ground cover, leaving bare dirt surrounded by the river rock ring. The pit itself was deep and wide, clearly meant for substantial fires. The trees around it had been trimmed back slightly, but not nearly enough. The nearest oak tree was maybe 10 feet away, its branches hanging over the pit. Chief Brennan walked around the pit slowly, taking measurements and photos. Torres did the same, making notes on a tablet. Neither of them looked happy. "Who authorized this construction?" Chief Brennan asked me. "The HOA president, Patricia Hoffmann. She claims they have the right to build community improvements on any property in the subdivision. Did they file for any permits with our office?" "I have no idea, but I'm guessing no." Torres checked something on his tablet. "No permit on file for this address. No notification of planned outdoor burning structures. Nothing." Chief Brennan shook his head. "This is a major violation. The clearance from those trees is nowhere near what's required. North Carolina Fire Code requires a minimum of 25 feet in all directions from any tree or structure for a permanent fire pit of this size. You've got maybe 10 feet at best. Plus, in a wooded area like this, you need additional clearances and safety measures. Spark arresters, fire suppression equipment nearby, cleared fuel breaks. None of that is present." "So what happens now?" I asked. "I'm going to issue a citation to the property owner, which is you, technically, but you can provide information about who actually constructed this. They'll face fines and will be required to either bring it up to code, which would mean removing a significant number of trees, or remove it entirely." "I vote for remove it entirely. That'll be up to whoever built it, but given the cost of compliance versus removal is probably more practical." He took a few more photos. "I'll also need to contact your HOA directly. Do you have contact information for Patricia Hoffmann?" I gave him Patricia's phone number and email address. Torres printed out a citation on a portable printer they had in their vehicle and handed it to me. It listed multiple violations of fire safety code and included a substantial fine if the violations weren't corrected within 30 days. "Can they still use it while it's out of compliance?" I asked. "Absolutely not," Chief Brennan said. "Any use of this fire pit in its current state would be a criminal offense. If you see anyone trying to light a fire here, call 911 immediately." The fine for using an unpermitted fire pit can be up to $10,000, plus potential criminal charges if it results in property damage or injury. After they left, I felt vindicated but also anxious. Patricia was not going to take this well. I was already imagining the phone calls, the angry emails, maybe even threats of countersuits. But I was also certain I was in the right. She had built on my property without permission, creating a safety hazard in the process. The law was on my side. I didn't have to wait long for the reaction. My phone rang at 4:30 and Patricia's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately and again. On the fourth call, I answered. "What did you do?" Her voice was shrill, higher pitched than usual. "The fire marshal just left my house threatening us with fines and legal action." I called them, "Patricia, you built a bonfire pit on my property without permission and apparently without following any safety regulations. You petty, vindictive man. Do you have any idea how much money we spent on that project? Nearly $4,000 of community funds. You shouldn't have spent it without permission. That's not my problem. This is going to go in your permanent HOA record, Samuel. Don't think you're going to get away with this. We have rules for residents who don't act in the community's best interest. And what are you going to do? Fine me. For what exactly? Protecting my own property, you'll see." She hung up. I saved the voicemail from her first call, which contained her basically admitting that the HOA had spent community funds on the unauthorized construction. I also took more photos of the pit and the citation, documenting everything. The next morning, Derek finally called me back. I explained the whole situation while he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They really screwed up," he said finally. "There's no way that bylaw clause gives them the right to build structures on your individually owned lot. That clause is about maintaining common property, like if everyone in the subdivision shares ownership of a pool or a park area. Your lot is deeded to you specifically. You pay taxes on it individually. It's not common property in any legal sense." That's what I thought. The thing is, even if they want to argue about the bylaws, they definitely needed your permission to enter your property and conduct construction. That's basic trespassing if you didn't consent, and the fire safety violations are just icing on the cake. So what should I do? Document everything. Keep copies of all communications with the HOA. File a formal complaint with the HOA board in writing, creating a paper trail. And if they retaliate against you in any way, you'll have grounds for a lawsuit. I spent that evening writing a formal letter to the HOA board, outlining my complaints and demanding that they remove the fire pit immediately, restore my property to its original condition, and reimburse me for any costs associated with fixing the damage they caused. I sent it via certified mail so I would have proof they received it. 2 days later, I got a letter from the HOA. It was not an apology. The letter, signed by Patricia and the 4 other board members, stated that I was being fined $1,500 for interfering with approved community improvement projects. It cited some obscure bylaw about residents being required to cooperate with HOA initiatives. It also stated that if I didn't pay the fine within 15 days, a lien would be placed on my property. I took photos of the letter and immediately forwarded them to Derek. He called me back within an hour, laughing. "This is amazing," he said. "They're making it so much worse for themselves." How is me getting fined amazing? Because it's retaliatory and completely without basis. You didn't interfere with anything. You reported safety violations to the proper authorities. That's not just your right, it's arguably your responsibility as a property owner. Any court is going to see through this immediately. So what do I do about the fine? Don't pay it. Let them try to put a lien on your property. When they do, we'll have even more evidence of overreach and retaliation. I'm actually going to represent you on this, Samuel. No charge. This is such a clear-cut case that it'll be good for my portfolio. And honestly, I hate HOAs that pull this kind of thing. Having Derek officially involved made me feel a lot better. He sent a letter to the HOA on his law firm's letterhead, informing them that I was represented by counsel and that any further actions against me would be considered harassment and grounds for a lawsuit. He also demanded that they remove the fire pit within 10 days or face legal action. The HOA's response was to schedule an emergency community meeting to discuss recent disruptions to community harmony. The notice went out to all residents in the subdivision, and the meeting was set for the following Thursday evening at the community center, a small building near the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. I showed up with Derek. The community center was packed, probably 30 people crammed into a space meant for 20. Patricia stood at the front with the other board members. Karen Whitley, the vice president, Doug Martinez, the treasurer, Linda Peterson, the secretary, and Robert Chen, the at-large member. The meeting started with Patricia giving a long speech about community values and the importance of everyone working together. She talked about the Bonfire pit as if it were a humanitarian project rather than an unauthorized construction on someone's private property. "And now we have one resident who thinks he's above the community," Patricia said, looking right at me. "One person who would rather ruin something beautiful that would benefit everyone just because it's on his land. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not how communities work. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good." A few people applauded. I noticed that most of them were regular attendees of HOA meetings, Patricia's core supporters. Derek stood up. "I'm Derek Morrison, Mr. Foster's attorney. May I speak?" Patricia looked like she wanted to say no, but with everyone watching, she nodded stiffly. "You have 2 minutes." Derek didn't need 2 minutes. The fire pit was constructed without Mr. Foster's permission on his privately owned land. It violates multiple fire safety codes and was built without proper permits. The fire marshal has already cited the location. These are facts, not opinions. The HOA had no legal right to build on Mr. Foster's property, and the retaliatory fine you've attempted to levy against him is illegal. If this board continues down this path, you will face personal liability for your actions. The room got very quiet. "Are you threatening us?" Karen Whitley asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm informing you of the legal reality," Derek said calmly. "Mr. Foster is willing to settle this simply. Remove the fire pit, restore his property, and drop all fines and threats. That's it. Or you can continue and we'll see you in court, where you'll face not only losing but potentially paying Mr. Foster's legal fees and damages." Doug Martinez, the treasurer, raised his hand. "If the HOA loses a lawsuit, who pays for it?" "The HOA's insurance might cover some of it," Derek said, "but given that this was an intentional act of trespass and unauthorized construction, your insurance might deny coverage. In that case, the board members who voted for this action could be held personally liable." I watched Patricia's face go pale. She clearly hadn't thought this through. Around the room, other residents were starting to murmur, asking questions about how much money the HOA actually had and whether they could afford a lawsuit. A woman I didn't know well, Margaret something, stood up. "I didn't vote for a bonfire pit. When was this voted on?" "At the September meeting," Patricia said. "It was in the agenda." "I was at the September meeting," Margaret said. "We voted on repainting the entrance sign and fixing the pond fountain. Nobody said anything about building a fire pit on someone's property." Patricia shuffled her papers. "It was included in the general improvements budget." "No, it wasn't," Doug Martinez said, and everyone turned to look at him. He looked uncomfortable. "I went back and checked the minutes after the fire marshal came to my house asking questions. The September vote was for general community improvements up to $5,000, but nothing specific was listed. Patricia told me later that she had decided to use that money for the fire pit, but it was never explicitly voted on." "That's within my discretion as president," Patricia said. "Actually, it's not," Linda Peterson, the secretary, said quietly. "The bylaws say expenditures over $1,000 need specific approval for specific projects." Patricia's face was getting red. "This is a ridiculous conversation. The point is, we did something nice for the community, and Samuel ruined it." "Samuel protected himself from liability," Derek said. "If someone had been injured using that fire pit, if a fire had spread to the woods and caused property damage, who do you think would have been held responsible?" "The property owner. My client. You put him at risk without his knowledge or consent." More murmurs in the crowd. A few people were nodding. Others looked confused. Some looked angry, but I couldn't tell if they were angry at me or at Patricia. Robert Chen, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "I think we should vote to remove the fire pit and restore Mr. Foster's property. This has gotten out of hand." Second, Doug Martinez said immediately. Patricia looked betrayed. We can't just give up. It's not giving up, it's cutting our losses, Doug said. If the fire marshal has already cited the location, and we don't have legal grounds to build there in the first place, we're just throwing good money after bad if we fight this. The vote was 4-1, with only Patricia voting to continue fighting. The motion passed. The board would hire someone to remove the fire pit and restore the wooded area as much as possible. The fine against me would be rescinded. Patricia stood up, grabbed her things, and walked out without another word. Karen Whitley hurried after her. After the meeting, several residents came up to me and apologized. They said they had no idea the fire pit was being built on my specific property without permission. They thought it was going on common land somewhere. A few mentioned that Patricia had been getting increasingly controlling over the past year, making decisions without full board consultation. Margaret, the woman who had spoken up during the meeting, introduced herself properly. Margaret Sullivan. She tried to fine me last year because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black, she said. I had to repaint it 3 times before she approved it. I'm sorry this happened to you. Derek and I left feeling cautiously optimistic. The fire pit would be removed, my property would be restored, and the whole thing seemed to be over. Except Patricia wasn't done. 2 days after the meeting, I received a call from my homeowners insurance company. They had received a claim that I had damaged HOA property and owed reimbursement. The claim was for $6,000, supposedly the cost of the fire pit construction plus additional expenses. I called Derek immediately. He groaned when I told him. She's trying to go around the board now, he said. Don't worry about it. Deny the claim. Provide your insurance company with all the documentation showing that the fire pit was built without your permission and was a violation of fire codes. They'll reject her claim. I did exactly that. I sent my insurance company copies of the fire marshal's citation, the photos of the unauthorized construction, the recordings and letters showing that I had repeatedly told Patricia to stop, and Derek's legal opinion that the HOA had trespassed on my property. My insurance company sent me a letter a week later confirming that they had denied the claim and would not be paying anything. They also noted that if Patricia continued to make fraudulent claims, she could face legal consequences. Meanwhile, the fire pit sat untouched in my woods. The HOA had voted to remove it, but nobody had actually done anything yet. I sent an email to the board members asking for a timeline. Doug Martinez responded that they were getting quotes from contractors to do the removal and restoration work. 3 weeks went by. The fire pit was still there. I sent another email. Doug responded that they had selected a contractor and were waiting for the paperwork to be finalized. Another 2 weeks, still nothing. I went to Derek. What can I do? They voted to remove it, but they're just dragging their feet. We send a demand letter giving them a firm deadline. If they don't meet it, we file suit. Derek sent the letter, giving the HOA 15 days to complete the removal and restoration or face legal action. The letter also demanded reimbursement for my legal fees so far, which were being tallied even though Derek was doing most of this as a favor. On day 14, a contractor finally showed up. 2 men spent an afternoon removing the river rocks, filling in the pit, and spreading new topsoil over the area. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The ground cover would take time to grow back, and a few small trees would need to be replanted, but the bonfire pit itself was gone. I thought that was the end of it. Then I got a notice from the Wake County Environmental Services Department. Someone had filed a complaint that I was illegally clearing wooded land on my property without a permit. They needed to send an inspector to verify. I knew immediately it was Patricia. Who else would it be? The inspector came out, looked at the area where the fire pit had been, and asked me what had happened. I showed him all my documentation. The fire marshal's citation showing the HOA had built the pit. The board meeting minutes showing they had voted to remove it. The contractor's invoice showing they had been hired to restore the property. The inspector made some notes and said he would close the complaint. "This is pretty clearly a retaliatory filing," he said. "We see it sometimes in HOA disputes. If you have any more problems, let us know." Filing false reports is taken seriously. But Patricia's harassment campaign continued in small ways. She started parking her car partially blocking my driveway when she came to visit her friend who lived nearby. She filed a complaint that my grass was too long, even though I had mowed it 3 days earlier. She tried to claim that my truck was an unauthorized commercial vehicle because it had a toolbox in the bed. Each time, I documented everything and reported it to Derek. He finally sent a cease and desist letter, warning Patricia that her continued harassment could result in a restraining order and a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. That seemed to work, at least for a while. Patricia stopped with the petty complaints and parking issues. The HOA sent me a formal letter of apology, signed by all the board members except Patricia, acknowledging that the fire pit construction had been inappropriate and thanking me for my patience during the resolution process. I thought we had reached an uneasy peace. Then, in early December, I came home to find that someone had dumped the river rocks from the fire pit back onto my property. Not in the same spot, but scattered throughout the woods, dozens of large rocks that clearly didn't belong there. Some were propped against trees. Others were half buried in the ground cover. It would take hours to collect them all and remove them. I called Derek, and he called the police. Officer Dana Sheffield came out to take a report. I showed her the rocks, explained the history with the HOA and Patricia, and provided all my documentation. She took photos and said she would follow up. 2 days later, Officer Sheffield called me back. We checked with the landscaping company that did the original fire pit removal. They confirmed that they hauled away all the rocks and disposed of them at a recycling center, so these rocks didn't come from that job. Then where did they come from? That's what I wanted to ask you. Did you see anyone on your property? Any vehicles you didn't recognize? No, I was at work all day. What about security cameras? I kicked myself mentally. I don't have any. You might want to invest in some. In the meantime, I'm going to have a conversation with Miss Hoffmann and make it clear that trespassing on your property for any reason is illegal and will result in charges if it continues. I decided to take Officer Sheffield's advice seriously. I ordered a home security system with cameras that covered my driveway, front yard, backyard, and the entrance to the wooded area. The system would alert my phone whenever it detected motion and would store footage in the cloud. The cameras were installed within a week. I felt better knowing that if anyone came onto my property again, I would have evidence. In the meantime, I spent a miserable weekend collecting all the dumped rocks and hauling them to the curb for bulk trash pickup. My back ached for days afterward. 2 weeks later, the cameras caught something. It was just after midnight on a Saturday. My phone buzzed with a motion alert. I was already in bed but not quite asleep. I opened the camera app and saw a figure moving through my backyard toward the woods. The infrared cameras made everything look grainy and black and white, but I could make out someone wearing dark clothing and carrying something. I immediately called 911. "Someone is trespassing on my property," I told the dispatcher. "I have them on camera right now." "Are they armed?" "Are you in danger?" "I don't think so. They're in my backyard, heading into the woods. I'm watching on my security camera. Stay inside your home. Officers are on the way. I kept watching the camera feed. The figure moved deeper into the woods, disappearing from view of that camera, but then appearing on another one I had positioned to watch the area where the fire pit had been. They were carrying what looked like paint cans. My stomach sank. What were they planning to do with paint? I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. The figure on the camera seemed to hear them too, because they suddenly dropped whatever they were carrying and ran back toward the edge of my property. But they didn't make it far. I watched on my front yard camera as 2 police cars pulled up, and officers jumped out. They intercepted the figure as they tried to run across my front lawn. I went outside, staying on my porch like the dispatcher had told me to do. The officers had the person on the ground, hands behind their back. They were putting handcuffs on. Officer Sheffield was one of the responding officers. She came over to me. "Mr. Foster, can you confirm that you don't know this person and didn't give them permission to be on your property?" I looked at the person being held by the other officer. It was hard to see in the dark, but as they turned their head, I recognized her, Karen Whitley, the HOA vice president. "I know who she is," I said. "She's the vice president of my HOA. But no, she absolutely does not have permission to be here. We found spray paint cans in your woods. It looks like she was planning to vandalize something." I showed Officer Sheffield the camera footage on my phone. She watched it, then went to confer with the other officers. After a few minutes, they helped Karen to her feet and walked her to one of the police cars. Officer Sheffield came back to me. "We're arresting her for trespassing and attempted vandalism. We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement and provide copies of your security footage." "Of course." "One more thing," Officer Sheffield said. "When we searched her, we found a notebook with detailed notes about your property and schedule. What time you leave for work, when you come home, when your trash goes out. It's pretty concerning." I felt a chill run down my spine. "She's been watching me. It looks like it. We're going to investigate whether there are any stalking charges that would apply." After the police left, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the cameras every few minutes, half expecting to see someone else lurking in my yard. The idea that Karen had been surveilling me, learning my patterns, was deeply unsettling. The next morning, I went to the police station and gave my statement. I provided copies of all my security footage and the documentation of the HOA dispute. The detective I spoke with, Detective Williams, told me that Karen had been charged with criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. They were also looking into whether Patricia Hoffmann was involved. "Miss Whitley isn't talking much," Detective Williams said, "but we did find text messages between her and Patricia Hoffmann discussing ways to make you regret reporting the fire pit. That's potentially conspiracy to commit vandalism, and depending on what else we find, there could be stalking or harassment charges. I just wanted them to remove a fire pit they built without permission," I said. "This has gotten completely out of control." Unfortunately, HOA disputes can bring out the worst in people. We see it more often than you'd think. Over the next few days, the story spread through Meadowbrook Estates. I got phone calls and visits from neighbors expressing shock and support. Most people had no idea that the conflict had escalated to the point of criminal behavior. Several people mentioned that they had never liked Patricia's leadership style, but had been afraid to speak up. Margaret Sullivan organized a petition calling for Patricia and Karen to resign from the HOA board. Within a week, over 30 residents had signed it. A special board meeting was called. I attended with Derek, though I wasn't sure what to expect. The community center was even more packed than last time. Patricia was there, looking defiant. Karen's seat was empty since she was out on bail with conditions that she not attend HOA functions. Margaret Sullivan presented the petition. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates deserve leadership that acts lawfully and in the genuine, best interests of the community. The actions of the current president and vice president have exposed the HOA to legal liability, cost us thousands in unnecessary expenses, and created a hostile environment. We demand their immediate resignations. Patricia stood up. This is a witch hunt. I have dedicated 3 years to this community, and this is the thanks I get. Because I tried to do something nice, and one difficult resident overreacted. You built on his property without permission, Margaret said. Then when he rightfully complained, you harassed him, filed false reports against him, and apparently conspired to vandalize his property. That's not leadership. That's criminal behavior. I had nothing to do with what Karen did. She acted on her own. Then, why are there text messages between you two discussing ways to retaliate against Mr. Foster? Derek asked, standing up. The police have those messages, Patricia. This is beyond just poor judgment. You've engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment against my client. The room erupted in arguments. Some people defended Patricia, saying she had done a lot of good for the community and this was an overreaction. But more people called for her resignation, saying they had lost trust in her leadership. Doug Martinez, the treasurer, called for a vote. All those in favor of asking Patricia Hoffmann and Karen Whitley to resign from the board, say aye. The ayes were overwhelming. Only a few people voted against it. Patricia grabbed her purse and coat. Fine. You want me gone, I'm gone. But don't come crying to me when this community falls apart without proper leadership. She stormed out. The board moved to hold elections for new leadership. Margaret Sullivan was nominated and elected as the new president. A man named Tom Chen, Robert's brother, was elected vice president. They both pledged to run the HOA in a transparent, lawful manner and to never make major decisions without proper community input. At the end of the meeting, Margaret approached me. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Samuel. The first thing we're going to do as a new board is write a formal apology and make sure you're reimbursed for any expenses you incurred because of this mess. I appreciate that. And I promise you, things are going to change. No more secret decisions. No more building things on people's property. We're going to be a real community again. The legal process continued for Karen and Patricia. Karen pleaded guilty to trespassing and attempted vandalism. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, 100 hours of community service, and a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. Patricia was charged with conspiracy and harassment. The text messages between her and Karen showed clear evidence that Patricia had encouraged and planned the vandalism attempt, even if she hadn't physically participated. After months of legal wrangling, she accepted a plea deal, guilty to conspiracy and harassment, 2 years probation, a fine, and a restraining order. Both women were also named in my civil lawsuit for trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress. Derek filed it in March, seeking damages for all the expenses I had incurred, the damage to my property, and the emotional toll of months of harassment. The lawsuit was against Patricia and Karen individually, not the HOA itself, since they had acted outside their official capacity. The case settled out of court in September, almost a year after the whole thing started. The terms were confidential, but I received a settlement that more than covered my legal fees, the cost of the security system, the time I had taken off work, and compensation for the loss of enjoyment of my property during the dispute. The wooded lot slowly recovered. I planted new trees where the fire pit had been, and over time, the ground cover grew back. I still sat on my bench in the mornings with my coffee, listening to the birds. The deer came back too, no longer spooked by construction noise and human activity. The HOA under Margaret's leadership was completely different. They communicated clearly about all decisions, held regular meetings with open forums for resident input, and never once tried to build anything on anyone's property without explicit written permission. The community actually felt like a community again, rather than a dictatorship. I saw Patricia once more, months after everything was settled. I was at the grocery store in Raleigh and she was in the produce section. We made eye contact briefly. She looked away quickly and moved to a different aisle. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to say anything. It was over. Looking back on the whole experience, I sometimes wondered if I could have handled it differently. Maybe if I had been more diplomatic with Patricia from the start, or tried harder to negotiate. But then, I remembered that she had built a fire hazard on my property without asking, had tried to fine me for reporting it, and had encouraged her vice president to vandalize my land. Some people don't respond to diplomacy. Some people only understand consequences. The important lesson I learned was about standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. If I had just let Patricia build that bonfire pit, if I had accepted the HOA's overreach because fighting back seemed too hard, where would it have ended? Would they have built a storage shed on my property next? Decided that my backyard would be a nice place for a community garden? There has to be a line, and for me, that line was my property rights. Derek told me later that my case had become somewhat famous in local legal circles as an example of HOA overreach and the importance of properly following fire safety regulations. He used it as a teaching example in a seminar he gave to other attorneys about HOA law. The fire marshal's office also used the case as an example in their outreach programs about fire safety. Chief Brennan called me once to ask if he could use photos of the unauthorized fire pit in a presentation about common violations. I said yes, hoping that maybe my experience would prevent someone else from having to deal with a similar situation. Life in Meadowbrook Estates gradually returned to normal. The new HOA board focused on actual community needs, maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and communicating clearly about decisions. They never once tried to build anything on my property. I even attended a few HOA meetings, just to stay informed and show support for the new leadership. It was strange being in that same community center where Patricia had once berated me, but now the atmosphere was completely different. People were friendly, discussions were respectful, and decisions were made democratically with proper input from residents. One thing that surprised me was how many other people came forward with stories about Patricia's behavior once she was gone. Apparently, I wasn't the only one she had harassed. There was a couple who had been fined repeatedly for their choice of porch furniture. A single mother who had been cited for her children's toys being visible in the front yard. An elderly man who had been threatened with fines because his lawn had brown spots during a drought. Patricia had used the HOA as her personal fiefdom, imposing her aesthetic preferences and controlling behavior on everyone around her. The bonfire pit situation had finally been egregious enough that people couldn't ignore it anymore, and it had brought down her entire regime. Margaret Sullivan told me during one HOA meeting that membership had actually increased since Patricia left. People who had avoided HOA functions because they didn't want to deal with Patricia's attitude were now participating actively. The community was stronger without her. As for the wooded lot itself, I decided to do something positive with the experience. I created a small nature trail through the trees, with a few benches placed at scenic spots. I opened it up to any neighbors who wanted to walk through and enjoy the peaceful environment. Several people took me up on the offer, and I would occasionally see someone sitting on one of the benches, reading or just enjoying the quiet. One neighbor, an older woman named Helen who lived 3 houses down, told me that walking through my woods had become part of her daily routine. "It's so peaceful here," she said. "Thank you for sharing it with us." That's what community was supposed to be about: sharing and cooperation, not control and dominance. Patricia had lost sight of that if she had ever understood it in the first place. The fire marshal's citation remained framed in my office as a reminder. Not a reminder of the conflict, but of the importance of safety regulations and proper procedures. Those rules existed for good reasons. If someone had lit a fire in that pit before it was removed, if the fire had spread to the surrounding trees, if my property or neighboring properties had been damaged, or if someone had been hurt, the consequences would have been severe. Patricia had been so focused on her vision of a community bonfire gathering that she had ignored all the practical concerns. That was her fatal flaw as a leader. She prioritized image over substance, control over consent, and her own desires over the rights of others. I hoped she learned something from the experience, though I honestly doubted it. People like Patricia rarely accepted responsibility for their actions. They always found a way to blame someone else, to see themselves as the victim rather than the aggressor. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My property was mine again, peaceful and secure. The HOA was functioning properly under good leadership. The legal matters were resolved. I could finally relax and enjoy the home I had bought, the woods I had fought to protect, and the community that had emerged from the chaos. On a cool evening in late October, exactly 1 year after the bonfire pit was first built, I walked out into my woods. The trees were turning colors, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows against the blue sky. The spot where the fire pit had been was barely visible now, covered in new growth and fallen leaves. In a few more years, there would be no sign that anything had ever disturbed this spot. I sat on my bench, the same one I had sat on the morning after discovering the construction, and I felt at peace. The fight had been exhausting and stressful, but it had been worth it. My property was intact. My rights had been defended. And the community was better off for the changes that had resulted. As the sun set through the trees, painting everything in golden light, I thought about how many homeowners probably faced similar situations every day. HOAs overstepping their authority, building where they shouldn't, fining people for nonsense, making life miserable for residents who just wanted to live in peace. Most people probably gave in rather than fighting back because fighting was too expensive, too time-consuming, too stressful. I had been lucky. I had a friend who was an attorney. I had the resources to install security cameras. I had the time and energy to document everything and see it through. Not everyone had those advantages. That was something that needed to change too. HOAs needed stronger oversight and clearer limitations on their power. Homeowners needed better protections against exactly the kind of abuse I had experienced. But those were battles for another day, for other people. My battle was over and I had won. Not just in the legal sense, though that mattered, but in the more important sense of protecting something I valued. My home, my land, my peace of mind. The woods were quiet around me, just the sound of wind in the leaves and the distant call of an owl. This was why I had bought this property. This moment right here. No bonfire pit could ever be worth more than this. I sat there until the stars came out, then walked back to my house, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves, feeling grateful for all of it. The struggle, the resolution, the peace that followed. It had all led here, to this moment of quiet satisfaction. And somewhere out there, Patricia Hoffmann was no longer my problem. That, perhaps, was the best part of all.